Hey, how you doing, everybody? It's Don Fox here on May 17th, and we're doing the our weekend report. And we were joined this week by Raphael, the super hot weather girl, and she's going to enlighten us on weather modification.
Hello, Don.
How you doing, Raphael?
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for being here, and we're looking forward to you enlightening us on the topic of weather modification.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share some of our hidden history on the subject with your audience and listeners. And it's really a vast terrain, so we're going to be going a little bit all over the place. So buckle up, guys. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Well, my audience is used to the bumpy ride. That's why they're here. So it's not a huge
Yes.
audience, but they know if they tune into my show, they're going to get some bumps and bruises. So
Okay. It's an important audience.
yes,
Well, I want to start off a little bit with who I am to be having this conversation with you guys. I'm merely really a nobody, just a free thinker who never lost her powers of observation, even though it took me a while to notice some things in my life. I'm a mom. I've got a 17-month-old at home. I'm a massage therapist as well. And one day I saw a documentary that I thought was going to be about the chemical dispersant they used after the Gulf oil spill. It was called What in the World Are They Spraying? And as fate would have it, well, it wasn't about that. It was about chemtrails, which, people roll their eyes. It's a conspiracy theory. But I happened to walk my dog immediately after seeing the movie, and it happened to be that I actually saw a display in the sky of exactly what the movie was talking about, which to me not only horrified me, but confirmed this happening and phenomena to me. And that opened the door to a whole new rabbit hole, which I couldn't help but plunge into. It's not a very popular subject. It is completely blacklisted by the media. There has been instances where there were references to some of the technology involved in this issue. But basically what I saw that day was what started out being a completely blue sky day, not a cloud in the sky, but what was happening were these planes were out, and they were crisscrossing all across the sky, and everywhere they passed, they left their quote-unquote contrail, which is in theory condensation trails, but these trails were not dissipating. And what's more, they were fanning out, and altogether they completely grayed out the blue sky and the bright sun so that you can actually stare at the sun without burning your eyes. Now, that was just incredible to me, that the sky could disappear behind some trails, and where have I been my whole life to not have noticed that? Now, I paid attention. This was back in 2011, very beginning of 2011, and I was paying attention. For the next 2 months, I didn't see anything like that. And I thought maybe one of these long trails, but I didn't see a total haze out of this. Even though the weather didn't change and it was the same time of the year, I knew that that was my calling and my invitation to get to the bottom of this and to spread the message. Now, I thought it would be easy and people would be interested in it, but there's just a lot of dismissal. You get called a conspiracy theorist. So it took me a long time to wrap my head around the subject. And what I've discovered.
yeah, that whole term conspiracy theorist, I guess I wear that badge with honor. But it's not really accurate though. We're not we're observing what's going on, and we're trying to determine what is actually happening versus what they tell us. So,
Exactly. And
you know, I,
using our own powers of discernment.
yeah, I guess critical thinker I think is a better adjective. Or what I even
Sure.
call myself is a historian. I do a lot of 9/11.
Exactly.
I do a lot of 9/11 stuff, and like I've said in some of the articles, hey, what if the official story isn't physically possible, then it cannot be historically accurate.
Exactly. And actually, I'll tell you one thing more. The term conspiracy theory was a term that was weaponized by the CIA to kind of quiet those nasty little rumors about Watergate back in the Nixon days.
Actually,
So,
it goes all the way back to the JFK assassination. Actually,
Oh, even the, okay, great. Well, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, or those who use that term are. But we don't let that deter us from, because the truth does not fear honest investigation.
No, but the
And this is
power
what we're
structure
doing.
does. Yeah.
The power structure absolutely does. And what they use to intimidate you is to tell you that you're not a scientist. You couldn't possibly understand what you're looking at. And yet observation is an essential part of the scientific process. One of the first part of, a great part of the scientific process. So I invite everyone who's listening in to not take anything I say seriously, but do your own research. Take it seriously enough to do your own research. Please let it inspire some thought and some curiosity. So basically what I found out is that we have, first of all, we have to kind of define the chemtrails, or what are chemtrails for, but what we're seeing these plumes coming out of planes, and they're not dissipating, but actually there's many different cocktails, so some of them do dissipate. But we're seeing our skies changing after the passage of planes. And it turns out, there's a lot of different applications and cocktails and uses for aerial dispersal technologies. And one of the big components is weather modification. It is not the only component, the only use of these chemtrails and aerial sprayings, and the only element in it. There's an electromagnetic component. We'll get into that some more later. But most people, when they deny chemtrails, they also don't realize. Well, some people think we're not technologically advanced to really control the weather or to affect the weather besides CO2, quote unquote. What they don't realize is the vast amount of history of weather modification that dates back to the 1800s, and maybe even before that, but definitely in the late 1880s, we've got government sponsoring weather modification projects in Texas. There's a great big history of weather modification in Texas, and back in the day, after battles, the soldiers would notice that there would be a rain that would come to the battlefield, and they hypothesized that maybe the cannon dust or fodder in the air would thicken the air and make it rain. So there's always been a curiosity about, man is curious about all things he can get his hands on. Like in 1890, I'll give you a little beginning here, U.S. Congress funded rainfall enhancement experiment, which was overseen by General Robert S. St. George Dyrenforth, and it was conducted in Texas, utilizing balloons and explosives, testing the theory that explosions in the atmosphere would induce energy, friction, and cloud condensation nuclei. U.S. government in 1904 begins using airplanes to conduct upper air atmospheric research, and the Wright brothers took their first flight in 1903, so it didn't take Uncle Sam long to go up there and start working with the weather and weather research. I'm fast forwarding a few things, 1916, the town of San Diego was having a drought, and they offered $10,000 to anyone who could make it rain. And a gentleman by the name of Charles Hatfield decided he was up for the challenge, and on January 5th, 1916, there was heavy rain that began falling and filled the reservoirs and broke one of the dams and created a lot of damage. When he went to collect the money, they told him, sure, you can collect the money, but you're responsible for the liability issue. And since there were some lives at stake and way more than $10,000 worth of damage, he declined on payment for that. But those are documented things. Our first patent for a cloud-making machine, number 1338343, was issued for process and apparatus for the production of intense artificial clouds, fogs, or mist. In 1927, patent 1619183, patent for process of producing smoke clouds from moving aircraft issued. Now, by the time they put a patent up, they've already done the research for a few years, and I've actually proven this to myself. There's a London Times magazine front page paper of 1922 showing that technology, aerial dispersal, on the front page of it, of the London Times. So this is not a new game. And for every 1 year of technology we're aware of, the military is 30 to 40 years ahead of us. That's not really a disputable fact. But what we found out early on is that there is a liability issue. So, and that comes up over and over again in the history of weather modification. So there's, when people say, well, we would know about it, well, how can we not know about it? Well, everybody wants to be the rainmaker. Nobody really wants to take the responsibility for the ill effects of it. And that's a very big incentive for keeping it on the hush-hush. But I'll list a few more examples throughout history where the liability issue was a big factor. Weather modification is the aspect that I'm focusing on these days because that history is hiding in plain sight, and it's really not deniable. You just have to look it up. And once people realize that we are, we have the technology for weather manipulation and climate change. The question is, especially in the climate change debate, why is this not being addressed as a factor contributing to climate change? That all these climate changing technologies are actually in use, but nobody's addressing that in the climate change issue. Now, my personal stand, global warming, climate change, real hoax. I'm going to tell you one thing. I don't commit to either side, but I'll say that the truth, I think both sides hold a kernel of truth. As usual, the lie is divided into halves so that both sides will fight each other while the truth runs away around the corner and the robbers run away with the bank. Yes, I believe global warming is happening. I also believe global cooling is happening. When you look at the patents for chemically nucleated ice or biologically nucleated ice, you realize that pretty much they can do whatever they want. And then, we have half the country in drought. The other half is plummeted in snow. It's a new phenomena, and it's deliberate. How much of it is deliberate, how much of it is a bad side effect of this technology being used, I'm not exactly sure, but they have a lot of, they've learned how to do a lot with this stuff, and every year they're getting better at getting the results they want, although there's probably side effects that they don't intend. There's another aspect to this besides the liability issue, and that's a governance issue. And the governance issue, well, you've got, some people say when you talk to them about chemtrails, and then they do a little internet search, and they say, oh, you mean cloud seeding. Well, that's just a little, cloud seeding, let's talk about that. We have in the 50s, was it in the 50s or the late 50s, early 60s, no, 1959, ranchers in the Davis Mountains in Jeff Davis County file a suit against Southwest Weather Research, Inc. They were concerned that the cloud seedings would lessen the amount of rain that would ordinarily fall on their lands and claimed that the people carrying out the weather modification project did not have a right to affect the weather over their lands. And they went to the Texas Supreme Court, which ruled that the cloud seeding could continue because all Texans are entitled to the water above them, even if it was in the clouds. Similar arguments for and against the use of cloud seeding to minimize hail losses surfaced in the high plains in the 1970s. So there's local cloud seeding projects, people that have a drought, and so you want benign use of weather modification. But then there's also the governance issue because you have the secret government agenda and the secret government wanting to use it for their applications and their purposes. And I'll get into some of the other uses for chemtrails in a minute here. The big question, geoengineers, now that we have global warming is on the table and everyone is shaking in their boots for global warming, they're saying that they're going to need to protect us from global warming by spraying metal particulates in the sky. Now, this is not weather modification. This is SRMs, solar radiation management, where they're going to spray aluminum, barium salts to create this metallic shield that will bounce off the heat and shade us from the sun. The problem is that, first of all, they've been doing this long enough to actually affect climate change. Studies have shown that this technology causes holes in the ozone, and while it may have a short-term cooling effect, on the long term, it'll have more of a Venus effect where it'll trap the heat in. Venus is a very hot planet, not just because it's closer to the sun, but because it's fully covered in cirrus cloud, or maybe not cirrus, but in clouds, and the heat doesn't get a chance to escape. So experiments and studies have actually confirmed that it's just a short-term fix, but on the long term, we'll actually need to spray more to counter the effects of the global warming climate change. And the holes in the ozone are created by that. So there's no way that it cannot do what it claims it's going to do. And that's why also I do not really like the word geoengineering for the term chemtrails. The military actually use the term chemtrails themselves, so it is the right term to use. They are chemical trails. Geoengineering is the justification of the use of a technology that is going to be needed because of that technology. So it's kind of this weird catch-22, maybe, if that's the right metaphor. It cannot help us with global warming. It can only exacerbate it or create it. And I'll say this, NASA, think what you want of them, but by the official rhetoric, they themselves have admitted that at least 45% of climate change and global warming can be attributed to aerosols and not CO2. Now, none of this that I'm saying is to minimize the destruction of the planet through our environmental pollutions and all that. I'm not trying to take away from that. We're doing lots of harm in lots of ways, but I believe, and so do a lot of us activists around the world on this issue, believe that the spraying of our skies is probably by far the worst thing that is contributing to climate change / global warming or global cooling, or whatever it is that we're wanting to get out of the sky. So this is a little bit of the landscape here. We haven't even touched on the other applications to the aerial dispersion of the metal particulates, what else it can be done with it. But this is it for a start. And before I continue, I'd like to just see if there's any questions that spring to mind right off the bat, or if you're...
No, I think I'm just going to let you roll with it. I've done minimal research on these sort of topics, so I'm not going to rain on your parade here.
Well, but if you wanted to rain on my parade,
yeah, well, I can chime in with some uninformed comments, but
sure, and please do, because that's the conversation. Sometimes people, you're representing your audience, so any questions are welcome, or any skepticism is welcome.
Well, I have no doubt they're spraying stuff. I mean, I was sitting outside last week, and I'm out in the lawn chair catching a couple of rays, and then a plane that was flying not that high came by, and it had this big, thick trail behind it. And it didn't look like, back in the 70s when I was a kid watching planes fly around, you would see just the little trails off the wings. And this is
right.
this stuff's coming like out of the tail section or whatever. I'm like, that's not a contrail. So
it's coming out of the tail section, exactly.
A big, thick white, and I'm like, well, that's phony baloney.
And one of the things, like, people say, well, all right, there's a long persistent plume, and then there's a short little contrail next to it. Well, what negators of the chemtrail theory, chemtrail issues say, well, there's no way you can know what atmosphere it was done at, different atmospheric conditions on different layers, and maybe one plane's higher than the other, or in a little different airspace. And granted, that's true, but we already have evidence. We have planes, we have videos, and we've seen it with a contrail. See, what they're calling, what we call chemtrails, what is the official name for it, the excuse for it, is persistent contrail. We've seen persistent contrails in the sky, and we've seen a plane with a short contrail intersect it. Hence, we've proven that they're at the same space at the same time, with producing different results out of their trails. If the conditions for the sky would yield persistent contrails, it should do so for all the planes intersecting at that same point in space and time. Now, deniers just skirt around points and try to intimidate you with science, but they can't really address some of the issues. And as another way we know is that persistent contrails supposedly are formed in high humidity under a certain temperature, and we've seen it in dry skies with a certain temperature, with like conditions that don't yield to alleged persistent contrails. So there's a lot of ways we've been able to validate for ourselves that it's not the bogus propaganda that we're sold.
Yeah, I guess what I could say is we were having a drought here in Minneapolis. We hadn't had much rain, February, March, April, and then into early May, still no rain. So I'm sitting outside that one day. Here comes the plane, and then since then now we've had rain maybe like 5 out of 7 or 8 days. I think it's rained now, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Since the spring, you're saying?
Yeah. So we had no rain, and now it's like, okay, now that it's, we're recording this at 3:23 in the afternoon here, and it's dark outside. It should be bright light right now, but it's supposed to rain today, and then we're going to get heavy rain tomorrow.
So here's what I invite your listeners to do, because most people don't study the sky. Most people glance up at it for a minute, and then they go back down to their iPhone. It's busy times, and it's understandable, but when you look at the sky, I invite you to not just take a picture of it with your eyes, but actually roll the camera. Look at the sky, see what's going on, and follow it. The planes have come out, follow how the trails then fan out, how they form, how they interact with everything else. Look at, not just do a time lapse with your powers of observation. Don't just take a snapshot, because in a snapshot you don't really realize. I mean, once I realized that what was going on, I couldn't understand how I missed it my whole life. And now, weather modification and government experiments have been going on for decades now. I mean, we weaponized weather back in Vietnam, Project Popeye. Congress didn't find out about it for 10 years. Just with a simple cloud seeding experiment, they were able to extend the monsoon season and bring down bridges and do what they needed to for their agenda.
Yeah, they were really messing with Vietnam. They sprayed all the Agent Orange to kill the plants, and then they were seeding the clouds to induce heavy rainfall.
Oh yes.
Yeah, Vietnam not only got bombed into oblivion and napalmed. I mean, there was Agent Orange, then the weather experiments. And
I'll tell you, they're experimenting. Things that I can't prove because I've spoken to people in the military. Like they love the islands for experimenting as well. They've been doing. There's a lot more experiments that have gone on that we just can't even find out about. And so when people say, well, if they were doing this, we would know about it. Well, didn't find out about it for 10 years. Congress didn't. And then the UN made a law saying no weaponizing weather, which that stops bad boys, doesn't it? But the experimentation continued, and it wasn't until 1995, 96, and 97 that people like you and me started seeing that there was a global agenda. All the NATO countries started reporting. The reports started coming in. This was becoming implemented on a large scale. This wasn't just a few projects here, a few projects there. It went into international. And at first it was just the NATO countries that would see this. Now we can see this. I don't know if we do have control over the airspace over China. Maybe China's doing their own thing. I would love to go to China just to observe the sky, but that'd be the only reason I would want to go there.
China's got a lot of pollution issues too, so it's hard to determine what would be really going on there. I mean, of course they made it for the Olympics. We heard about that, but that's what we heard about. They've dumped so much junk in the rivers over there. Some of them catch on fire. So.
Oh yes, I mean the pollution is definitely an issue. And now what I saw in the movie, What in the World, and what I've further research has shown in California, we're having like Shasta County in California just had a really probably the largest anti-chemtrail geoengineering weather modification breakthrough, where they approached City Hall or their county commission, I'm not exactly sure, and they made the news, and they brought in experts from all over the world. And their aluminum is off the charts, and there's different imprints of the metals and the pollution from, chemical imprints from China. We know what those are when we see it, but what we were seeing did not match that imprint. Now, some people say aluminum exists everywhere in nature, but it's usually bonded with another element. It's not free-forming, and people's hair analysis tests is coming back high in aluminum. They're also using barium and strontium are in the patents, and what they say they will need to use in the future. Now, in the movie, What in the World Are They Spraying? It starts off with a few news reports. One guy is a weatherman. This was probably before he probably got fired, or they shut him up after this, but he's talking about these clouds, but these are not normal clouds, he says. They're normal. This is actually, now the military won't confirm this, but I was in the military and I know, but this is actually military chaff, and they're conducting experiments. But then they go to a geoengineering conference, and David Keith is the lead goon heading the geoengineering debate. Maybe they'll make him a fall guy or whatever, but he's pushing for, and he was even in that, what's that comedy show, the Colbert Report. He was on the Colbert Report talking about, we're going to need to do this in the future. These crazy scientists are talking about doing it in the future. And in the movie, What in the World Are They Spraying? He says, well, actually, it's not dangerous. It's more like free riding on our grandkids. Well, I don't know about you. I got a 17-month-old, and I don't care to free ride on my grandkid. I am in very good company of individuals around the world who have waken up one at a time and demand not only full disclosure of what's going on and the history of this technology that's been used. We want people to know about it, but we demand an end to it. Just let nature run its course on its own.
Yeah, I was going to say real quick, when you talk about barium and strontium and aluminum, especially when you talk to a 9/11 nuke guy like myself, those are the same elements we're seeing in the USGS dust samples. So it almost makes you wonder if they're just dumping nuclear waste products on us.
Well, there is a radioactive thorium that's sometimes found in that, and the depleted uranium has been found. Desiccated blood cells have been found. Then we're going to go into nanotechnology, Morgellons. I know 4 people with Morgellons. That personally, I know more online that I've never met, but Joni Mitchell, the singer, has Morgellons disease. It's the fiber disease, fibers that come out of the skin, and the CDC says that people who have that are just crazy, and it's a figment of their imagination, even though in some cases it's contagious, not all of it. But out of the 4 people I know who have Morgellons disease, 3 of them in 3 different cities in 2 different countries, Canada, down here in Louisiana, in Cajun land, and in San Diego, 3 of them got it after touching funny fallout. 2 touched funny fallout. 1 got caught in rain, and somebody else in her jogging group also got sick. But if you ever see those spider webs, it's not necessarily in the city you'll see them, but out sometimes in the countryside, they're like these long, the sprayers will come out, and then afterwards the field will be full of these long spider webs looking things that are not. Under closer observation under the microscope, Carnicum Institute in California has plenty of research on that and lab work on it. But these are self-replicating nanotechnology. It's the most monstrous, satanic thing you can think of. I mean, these things are not alive. They're created in the laboratory, but they self-replicate, and they get in, and it makes your life miserable. And it's not curable, but some people have managed to manage it and to keep it in check, where it's not the fibers, where they're managing their life through a non-GMO diet and different herbal. It's different for different people what ends up working, but it's not a curable thing. So that's another aspect that goes beyond the weather modification. Now, there's also satellite applications to all of this technology. So that's where the electromagnetic component, the electromagnetic component does affect the weather as well. Also, they can camouflage things on radar. They can bring things out on radar. It's funny because some of this technology can do one thing and then it could do the exact opposite of what it can do. I mean, just let's take weather modification. You can demoralize troops or you can raise the morale, depending on what you do with the weather or who you're doing it on. You can hide things on radar. You could bring things up on radar. You can create drought, and then you can charge things up and create fires. A lot of the fires we've seen on the West Coast, well, guess what, aluminum and all these things that end up not only causing drought in the root structures of the plants, but then make the trees more flammable. So all these crazy fires are tied into this. This technology affects by far just the most living systems. I mean, every living system, from our food, our plants, our air, our water, our own health. There's a vitamin D deficiency, which is just tremendous. Blocking out the sun is going to have an effect on that. There's a lot of things at play here, but there's a facility in Fairbanks, Alaska called HAARP, HAARP, High Active Auroral Research Project. It's an antenna array. How those work is the energy gets sent out, but if you just have a blue sky, that energy doesn't really have anything to bounce off of. So chemtrails are the medium, and directed energy is the method. They'll spray barium powders and let it photoionize from the ultraviolet light of the sun, and then they make an aluminum plasma generated by zapping the metal cations that are in the spray with either electromagnetics from HAARP or the gyrotron system on the ground, which is ground wave emergency network, or space-based lasers. The barium makes the aluminum plasma more particulate dense, and that means that they can make a denser plasma than they normally could from just ionizing the atmosphere or the air. And then they can make these particles collide into each other, then make it more charged. And what they're ultimately trying to do is create a charged particle plasma beam weapon. They use Gwen pulse radars. There's ground arrays. It's Tesla technology, basically. When Tesla, well over 100 years ago, discovered free energy, that technology did not die with him. Then you get into, the Air Force has a research paper called Owning the Weather in 2025. And they describe their plan, how they're going to go about this. And before that, there was a Spacecast 2020, another research paper that goes into great detail, and it has things in it, because it's not just on the Earth. We have what NASA is doing. Back during the Cold War, the Americans thought that there was hostility between the Americans and the Russians. Little do they know that we were actually conducting nuclear experiments in the upper atmospheres with the Russians. So there was a cooperation at that level, all while down below there's a whole other game going on. We don't know what's going up in space. And I'll give you an example. Number 16 on some of these, on the Spacecast 2020, which was written in, I believe it was 1984, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry, I'm a layperson. I'm a layperson with an intense curiosity. So I'm not necessarily scientifically minded. I've just taken a few years to wrap my head around the terrain and make some sense out of it and organize it and prove it to myself and now to others in my outreach. But number 16 is a Weather C3 system, a counterforce weather control system for military application. The system consists of a global on-demand weather observation system, a weather modeling capability, a space-based directed energy weather modifier, and a command center with the necessary communications capabilities to observe, detect, and act on weather modification requirements. Number 17, solar mirror system. Now, this is what the Nazis wanted. They had a sun gun, kind of like, the children playing with a magnifying glass and burning up an ant. This is kind of based on that. And, NASA was formed after Project Paperclip. Scientists, rocket scientists of Hitler's, were brought into this country because supposedly it was better if we had them than other people had them. And then you had NASA formed a few years later. So in NASA, there's the projects you and I know about publicly when you watch the nightly news, and then there's the whole other world of projects that you know nothing about. And number 17 on the Spacecast 2020 document is solar mirror system, a system of orbital mirrors to redirect solar energy for purposes of controlling terrestrial temperature and cloud patterns. This was in 1994. Now, if I jump around, please excuse me. It is a very vast terrain, and I'm still learning how to organize myself in the most fluid manner. But in 1997, if you think that, all this is me hypothesizing on some research papers that aren't based on anything, the Secretary of Defense of the United States he said that our enemies have technology to affect the weather, to trigger volcanoes, and to even to make earthquakes, and he says that that's why we need to intensify our efforts. This was in 1997. What he did not admit is that we have this technology. And granted, our enemies, if we have enemies, because I'm not sure if there's some sort of cooperation going on behind the scenes or what. That's hypothesizing in theory. But I'm sure there's a few mad scientists out there, and everybody wants their hand on the remote control. And that's the question: who's going to have their hand on the remote control? And that's also why the governance is an issue between local officials who want to make benign weather modification projects, like make rain on their field, and the government, who's got a whole other agenda, who wants to destroy the crops and control the food so that you can control the world or drive desperation or push us closer to the New World Order or whatever your theory is. There's never just one reason to do something. There's always multiple reasons and multiple ways to profit. Now, there's another...
But yes, now that is a key point. Yeah, exactly. There was never just one reason they removed Kennedy. There was never just one reason why 9/11 went down the way it did.
Yeah.
These big, these big operations. There's multiple reasons.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, there's did you know the sequel to What in the World Are They Spraying, called Why in the World Are They Spraying? And by the way, both of these movies are available online for free. You can just Google and YouTube. Talks about the world of weather derivatives. Hey, just in case you can get enough out of this conversation, here's another angle. People are betting on the weather, and boy, if you can actually have a say in that a moneymaker. I invite people right now, if they're listening and they Google at the same time, they can go to weathermodification.com and see if they can order some weather for themselves. That's one of the more benign chemtrails. Like I said, chemtrails means a whole lot of different things. It's basically the aerial dispersal of chemicals for multiple reasons. This is stuff that, first of all, you don't have the language for. Not you, but the general public is not given this language. And yet, we're told global warming, climate change, but no one is addressing climate-changing technologies. And yet, it's been a factor before in small cloud seeding projects where it was an issue of liability and who has a right to it and how does this affect us. And yet there are forms. I've got forms right here. States give out as it states, interim activity reports and final reports, U.S. Department of Commerce, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, number of modification days per major purpose. It's the Form 17-4A, weather modification activity, initial report on weather modification activities. This stuff is out there, and nobody is addressing that element. So if you want to talk about climate change, I say, let's go. But let's be honest about it. Let's talk about it all. And they don't want this part of the conversation to show up. They just want to steer us into the CO2, pay us some taxes. I don't know how that's going to be saving the world from anything. Especially, I'll tell you what, you could do whatever you want with your taxes. You can remove all the CO2 in the world. You can even stop polluting. But if you keep spraying the skies, you're not going to get rid of this climate change issue and the catastrophes that come with it, or the holes in the ozone as well. I can go back a little bit here and just let me touch on a few different highlights. 1952, U.S. White House Department of Weather Modification formed. 1953, President Eisenhower creates the U.S. Advisory Committee on Weather Control. Kurt Vonnegut's older brother, discovered that silver iodide was a more effective way to seed clouds. That was way back then. 53, 54, scientists at New York University seed 19 cyclones. 1958, Chief White House Advisor on Weather Modification, Captain Howard T. Orville, said the Department of Defense was studying ways to manipulate the charges of the Earth and sky and so affect the weather by using an electromagnetic beam to ionize or deionize the atmosphere over a given area. 58. Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, future president, made a prophetic opening statement at hearings before Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee of the Committee on Armed Services, saying, quote, "From space, the masters of infinity would have the power to control Earth's weather, to cause drought and flood, to change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, to divert the Gulf Stream and change temperate climates to frigid. There is something more important than the ultimate weapon, and that is the ultimate position, the position of total control over the Earth that lies somewhere in outer space. In essence, the Soviet Union has appraised control of space as a goal of such consequence that achievement of such control has been made a first aim of national policy. In contrast, our decisions more often than not have been made within the framework of the government's annual budget. Against this view, we now have on record the appraisal of leaders in the field of science, respected men of unquestioned competence, whose valuation of what control of outer space means renders irrelevant the bookkeeping concerns of fiscal officers." Also, there's a history of our government and corporations wanting global warming, wanting to melt the Arctic, wanting to create more enjoyable climate for the make it more a little tropical climate, more pleasurable climate for us, but also to access the resources up in the Arctic. And that's something. Now we have scientists telling us that when the ice is going to melt, whether you believe it or not, and the ice is going to melt, that there's a huge methane reserve that is going to be released into the sky, which is a game ender for all life on Earth if it all comes out at one time. So whether you believe that or not, it's concerning, and we all have a right to this conversation. We need to get the language for it because it's been kept from us. We need to understand the history of weather modification and understand that for the last 60 years our military has been using climate warming, climate changing technologies before global warming became quote unquote official.
Well,
so,
as a guy that lives in Minneapolis, a certain amount of warming wouldn't really rub me the wrong way, but I haven't really seen it yet. I guess I would say that.
Well, but that's because when you have chemically nucleated ice, you can do what you want, right? You have there's patents where they have biological, they have bacteria that can make plants freeze above freezing plant temperature. They have chemicals to make the ice. There's hail suppression, there's hail making, these softball size hail. I mean, nothing we've seen is unrelated to the technology that's been in use. Now, there's probably other side effects. Sure, when you if I pull on a knitted sweater on one end, the thread over there is going to be affected too. So I'm sure while they're affecting change in one area of the world, it's got a consequence somewhere else they may not intend. There's a whole bunch of stuff. We've seen dolphins burned to a crisp out at sea, and you wonder how that can be. Also, you have, HARP, the electromagnetic aspect of it has a few technologies. They want to map the Earth. They can send their beams down and see what resources are where and go down to the core. They can stimulate the core of the Earth, creating turbulences, creating earthquakes. Oh, what they don't deny, they deny, of course, that they're doing all these things. What they don't deny about HARP is that it's an ionospheric heater, and the Air Force admitted to managing the atmosphere. Now, why do we need the Air Force managing the atmosphere? You tell me.
Well,
but,
I'm sure they have our best interest at heart.
I sleep well at night, yes, thinking that they do, knowing that they do. But when you heat up the ionosphere, you expand it, and what you're doing then is that you can suction up the jet stream. You can move jet stream around, which is kind of one way. The half the country was kept in a high pressure system, get half the country in a drought, and the other under snow. But do you remember? Back in the day, you used to get if you watched the nightly news, the jet stream would come in through California and exit out through the East Coast. It just kind of goes across the country a little bit with a little variation. Well, now you have these land hurricanes, what I call. It's just huge, giant turning around weather systems that don't seem to make sense from the old weather that we used to see on the news on the Weather Channel. It's when you're looking at the series of tornadoes that are record-breaking forces and the record-breaking numbers, and you've got casualties, and this is affecting us. You may not want to see it. You may want to deny it. You want to stick your head in the sand, but you're going to be a victim of circumstance. I mean, granted, even if God is controlling the weather, you're going to be a victim of circumstance, but he's a little more graceful and generous with it. So let me read a study here. The IOP Science says there it goes into what the impact of geoengineering aerosols on stratospheric temperature and ozone. Geoengineering by means of sulfate aerosols is predicted to accelerate the hydroxyl-catalyzed ozone destruction cycles and cause a significant depletion of the ozone layer, even though future halogen concentrations will be significantly reduced. So that's one scientific proof that this is not going to be helping us. But in the Cold War, right, Russian oil engineer P.M. Borisov proposes melting the Arctic and Greenland ice caps in 1958 by spreading black coal dust on the ice, creating cloud cover across the pole to trap heat, and by diverting warm Atlantic waters into the polar regions. The scheme was taken seriously by Soviet climatologists. In 1960 to 61, Project Skyfire begins, lasting 22 years, and Storm Fury, both are studies into lightning and hurricane manipulation. Project Skywater in 61, Bureau of Reclamation, cloud seeding project funded by Congress. 1961, copper needles dumped into the atmosphere as telecommunications shield. They throw thousands of copper needles up into the air. What goes up must come down. Take a deep breath and relax. In 1961, scientists proposed artificial ion cloud experiments. In 1960, the dumping of chemicals, barium powder, etc., from satellites, rockets began. President John F. Kennedy says in a speech on September 15th, "We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. We shall propose, finally, a global system of communication satellites linking the whole world in telegraph and telephone and radio and television. The day need not be far away when such a system will televise the proceedings of this body to every corner of the world for the benefit of peace." I feel better. There's the patents go on and on. 1966, U.S. federal government spends about $7 million on projects including precipitation modification, hail suppression, fog and cloud dissipation. Okay, I'm going to continue. Here's another quote. Gordon J.F. MacDonald writes toward the year 2018, just a few years away. By the year 2018, technology, this was in 1968, technology will make available to the leaders of the major nations a variety of techniques for conducting secret warfare. There we get to the heart of the matter, of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need be appraised. One nation may attack a competitor covertly by bacteriological means, thoroughly weakening the population though with a minimum of fatalities, before taking over with its own overt armed forces. Alternatively, techniques of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm, thereby weakening a nation's capacity and forcing it to accept the demands of the competitor. Here's another quote in 1970. U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is still very active in 2012, published.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, yeah, one of our favorite guys around here.
He published Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. And this is a quote from that. Not only have new weapons been developed, but some of the basic concepts of geography and strategy have been fundamentally altered. Space and weather control have replaced Suez or Gibraltar as key elements of strategy. Future developments may well include automated or manned space warships, deep-sea installations, chemical and biological weapons, death rays, which Tesla already had created, and still other forms of warfare. Even the weather may be tampered with. Ooh. And indeed, we see this. Now, Project T-Drop was initiated to relieve a drought that affected large areas of West and South Texas. Planes equipped with silver iodide flares were dispatched. And as the drought worsened, the planes were sent into North Central and East Texas. The drought was broken at the end of June by widespread rainfall, and the program was suspended. At roughly the same time, Ground-based generators were utilized in Oklahoma to increase the chance that clouds would produce rain as they moved into Texas. In 1973, there are more than 700 scientists and engineers in the U.S. whose major occupation is weather modification. In 1977-78, the UN Environmental Modification Convention, NMOD, formerly the Convention on the Publication of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, prohibits the military or other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. The convention bans weather warfare, which is use of weather modification techniques for purposes of inducing damage or destruction. Like that worked. 1997, you have the HARP patent. Bernard Eastland authors U.S. patent number 4686605 and two others in which he references Tesla's work as a source of historical contribution. It is entitled Method and Apparatus for Altering a Region in the Earth's Atmosphere, Ionosphere, and/or Magnetosphere. And parts of it read, weather modification is possible by altering upper atmospheric wind patterns or altering solar absorption patterns by constructing one or more plumes of particles which will act as a lens or focusing device. 1991, 5003186, patent for stratospheric Welsbach seating for reduction of global warming issued. This is the number one chemtrail patent from Hughes Aircraft Company.
Just to go back a second. Now, I had heard they'd shut down HARP. Is that true, or?
Well, it really doesn't matter because there's a bunch of them in the world, and there's.
Did they move it? Yeah. Is there another facility, or?
That could have just been like a little show. Oh, we couldn't be doing it because we're closed now. But they got what they needed out of that, and they probably don't even need that anymore. They have satellite, they have ground arrays. There's also something that's happening is that laymen, weathermen are studying these. You had Rothschild acquisitioned a lot of the Weather Channel and a lot of the technologies, and they started cleaning up some of this side effect. But at the time of the tsunami, there were laymen weathermen that would study the radar, and still today, and they pick up these anomalies. And these are side effects kind of to the technology being used. They're not intended to be seen, but the radar picks it up. And you have HARP rings, you have these circles that show up and that seem to attract or excite the weather. There's scalar squares where you actually can have clouds that avoid a whole square area. People have found that a lot of these tornadoes, there's tornado generation with these ground-based. We think NEXRAD is actually helping to read the weather or see it coming, but what we don't realize is that there's also a component that, and this is probably because nobody's on record with this, but we're seeing activation of certain NEXRADs right where the worst eye of the tornado is happening. So I'm not equipped to get into the full science of it all, except that I know it's there, and I know that the technology is there, and I know what I've seen. And listen, if someone has a hard time grasping chemtrails, the rest of it is going to go over their head. Because I'll see a blue sky, I'll see no chemtrails, and then I'll see just in front of the sun gray particulate matter that is metallic. It is absolutely undeniably metallic, and it makes no sense considering that there'll be blue right next to it, but it's right in front of the sun. So there's a lot of they have other methods of dispersal, and I've even seen contrails. Some people say even contrails are chemtrails. I've seen a contrail plane with binoculars in South Carolina, which is military bases at the beach, that are being escorted by non-trail planes on the same trajectory. I call those quick disperse. It was a theory I had, and when I saw that one plane being escorted by the two other planes that didn't have any trails, I knew that I was right, because they'll come out on a day, a fleet of them. They don't make any sense. They're unmarked. And then the sky may be blue in the morning, but then by the end of the day, the particles are so heavy you can take your knife out and just slice the air almost. It's so thick, it's obvious. And there's also, we have patents and we've seen that there's additives in jet fuel. Now, I've heard from both people that worked in the military that have confirmed this and read it online, though a hard place to direct you to where, that they interact with each other. There's different cocktails. So the commercial planes could go about quite innocently, the pilots not know that they go about and there's just through the jet exhaust, they're throwing out the contaminants, which then the next sprayer, the unmarked government jet plane goes and sprays something else, which interacts with the trails, with the dispersed additives of the jet fuel. There's as many ways, as many cocktails as we could probably imagine, and probably more, because I'm sure most of us are not that heinous. Although we're probably hipped out to the fact that
see, that's the thing. A lot of regular people out there are like, well, I would never do something like that. Well, of course you
right.
wouldn't do it, but they will. They'll.
Right, and there's a doctor that talks about he's a whistleblower, and he's like, when people say, well, this can't be happening, or the pilots, how would they do that? Well, pilots are being told this is to combat global warming, and he says, and most of them are stupid enough to actually believe it. So, you don't hate on the guys doing the spraying, although by now they should have a clue, but if they're gung-ho, they're not going to really put it together. Also, when they say they wouldn't do it to us, I'm here to tell you, oh yes, and you've agreed to it. And I'll tell you how you've agreed to it. Through your silence. And mine as well, although I'm pretty vocal. Maybe you will be too once you hear this. Public Law 105-85. A public law serves to notify the public of something. If you don't object to it, it's law. And you've consented to it. So Public Law 105-85 says the Secretary of Defense cannot spray us for any reason, but cannot experiment biologically and chemically on the human population. Isn't that good news? Oh, wait. Read the exceptions. The listed 3 exceptions to their not being allowed to spray us for biological or chemical testing. The first one, only the first one exception listed in that. They can spray us biologically or chemically for any peaceful, that's a quote, peaceful purpose related to biological, agricultural, medical, pharmaceutical, agricultural, and yada, yada, yada. And if that's the exception number 1, what exactly are we protected from? Oh, it's got to be for a peaceful purpose. Well, the definition of peaceful is not really put into that document.
Yeah, who defines peaceful? Yeah. And this has been very informative, and we're rapidly reaching the end of our hour here. So I guess, is there any kind of final thoughts you'd like to wrap up with?
Sure. Well, some people may just say, I wish I never woke up, and this is really scary stuff. I say I wanted to forget it, but it hasn't stopped it, and it hasn't stopped it over the years. When we get the stomach for this and we start talking about it, because that's what needs to happen. This needs to get on the table. The conversation has to get on the table in the climate change debate so that we can know what we're looking at, really. Then we can say, well, whoa. We're playing a game of limited resources. We're fracking. We're destroying the Gulf. We're using nuclear radiation. Fukushima is still an ongoing nightmare that's raining down upon us. And who knows where. Why are we playing this game of limited resources when there is a greater technology being used as a weapon that might actually be able to liberate us on another level? So there's a lot to be gained from this. This could actually be an issue that helps liberate us from the other problems we're facing that are mounting at this time. And I invite everybody to don't take anything I say for granted. Look it up for yourself. Don't, stop making fun of other people talking about it. Start talking about it. Start demanding answers from your representatives. They do have to answer to you, and if enough people do this, they'll know that we're on to them. And there is a rising movement. I'm connected with people all over the world. We just did a global march against chemtrails and geoengineering. 21 countries were involved, multiple cities. People are waking up to this. They're looking up, speaking up, and demanding not just answers, but a stop to this. Once we face this, we can actually get better uses out of the technology than what we're using it for. At the very least, it's got to stop. And I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to get this message out to your listeners. And I thank you, Don. Thank you to everyone who's listened. And God help us all.
Well, thanks for being on the show today. Do you have a website or any contact info?
Well, I have a local page. I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana, NOLA. So I have Chemtrail Awareness Now, NOLA, where I try to post things. You can scroll all the way down to the bottom since the beginning of the page's inception to get a lot of juicy stuff. There's Geoengineering Watch. I don't know if it's .org. There's a lot of stuff on it. Just get past the one or two debunking websites, which are all government-affiliated websites, which are not going to really do anything but make you think you're an idiot that's not capable of knowing anything.
Don't even get me started on the debunkers, man. Don't even get me started.
Preaching to the choir here. That's wonderful.
Yes. Okay. So thanks a lot, Raphael, and we'll probably have you back here at some point. Maybe once I do some homework on this. I'm busy with my other endeavors, teaching myself.
I'm sure you'll be able to tell me some things. You have great powers of research, from what I understand.
Well, thanks for that, and we'll talk to you next time, Raphael.
Great. Thank you, Don.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Bye.